I'll never forget the way they looked at me that day. You know that expression people wear when they're watching someone fail, not with pity, but with satisfaction, like they're vindicated in their beliefs. That was Mrs. Henderson, the PTA president, standing in the hallway at Lincoln Middle School, arms crossed, surrounded by other parents who nodded along as she spoke. She didn't bother lowering her voice when she said it. Some people just aren't cut out for parenting. Look at David Martinez. That boy is going to end up nowhere with a father like that. The words hit me like a slap, but it was the murmurs of agreement that really stung. And just like that, I knew they had all written off my son before he'd even hit high school. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Roberto Martinez, and I've been raising my son David alone since he was 3 years old. I'm 42 now, working as a maintenance supervisor at the local community college, and I'd be lying if I said the last 14 years have been easy. When Maria left us, she didn't just take her clothes and her car. She took with her the kind of respectability that comes with two-parent households, PTA meetings, and playdates at houses with perfectly manicured lawns. David wasn't like other kids, and I wasn't like other parents. While the other fathers were signing their sons up for Little League and soccer camps, I was teaching David how to change the oil in our pickup truck and showing him the difference between different types of wrenches. When other kids were getting dropped off at birthday parties, David was with me at the hardware store, learning about plumbing fixtures and electrical wiring. The other parents thought I was crazy. "He should be playing sports," Mrs. Chen would say whenever she saw David helping me fix her leaky faucet. "He needs to socialize with children his own age, not spend all his time with tools." I'd smile politely and nod, but inside I was thinking about how David's eyes lit up when he successfully repaired something that was broken, how he took pride in work that mattered, how he was learning skills that would serve him for life. The criticism started early. At parent-teacher conferences, I'd sit in those tiny plastic chairs while teachers explained that David was bright but distracted, that he didn't engage with traditional learning methods, that he seemed more interested in understanding how things worked than in memorizing facts for tests. They said it like it was a character flaw. Mrs. Peterson, his fourth-grade teacher, once pulled me aside after a school event. "Mr. Martinez," she said, adjusting her reading glasses, "I'm concerned about David's social development. He spends recess by himself, taking apart old calculators and radios that he brings from home. The other children think he's different." The way she said different felt like an accusation. I tried to explain that David wasn't antisocial. He was curious, that he had friends, just not necessarily in his grade, that the janitor, Mr. Foster, had become something of a mentor to him, teaching him about the school's HVAC system during lunch breaks. But I could see in her eyes that this wasn't the kind of friendship she thought was appropriate for a 9-year-old. The comments from other parents were worse. At school pickup, I'd overhear conversations that weren't meant for me to hear. "Poor kid," one mother would whisper. "Living in that rundown house with just his father? No wonder he doesn't know how to interact with other children." Another would chime in, "I heard Roberto has him working like a little laborer. Child services should probably look into that." They saw David helping me install new gutters on our house and called it child labor. They didn't see the pride in his face when he measured twice and cut once, getting it perfect on the first try. They saw our old truck and assumed we couldn't afford better. They didn't know that David and I had rebuilt that engine together, and that he could diagnose a car problem better than most adults. The worst part wasn't the judgment. It was watching how it affected David. He started coming home with questions. "Dad, why don't you come to the PTA meetings like Tommy's mom? Why don't I have the same backpack as everyone else? Am I weird because I like fixing things more than playing video games?" I tried to shield him from the worst of it, but kids hear everything. They hear their parents talking at dinner, tables, they repeat conversations they don't fully understand. David came home one day in 6th grade, quiet in a way that worried me. Finally, he asked, "Dad, is it true that I'm going to end up in jail because I don't have a mom?" That night, I sat on his bed and tried to explain that people sometimes said things they didn't mean, that having a different kind of family didn't make us wrong or broken. But I could see the doubt creeping in, the way he started second-guessing himself, the way he began to hide his interest from classmates. The pressure from school intensified as David entered 7th grade. Guidance counselors suggested I consider alternative educational paths for him. The principal called me in for a meeting about David's unconventional responses to essay assignments. Apparently, when asked to write about his hero, David had written about Johannes Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, focusing on the mechanical engineering aspects rather than the historical significance. "Mr. Martinez," the principal had said, leaning back in his leather chair, "David is a smart boy, but he needs to learn to think inside the box if he wants to succeed in high school and college. His mind wanders to technical details when he should be focusing on broader concepts." I wanted to argue that maybe the box was too small, that maybe the world needed people who thought differently, who saw solutions where others saw problems. But I was just a maintenance worker in a room full of educators with degrees hanging on their walls. Who was I to question their expertise? The breaking point came during 8th grade, at a school board meeting about funding for the arts and athletics programs. I had gone to support additional funding for the industrial arts program, the one class where David truly thrived. As I waited to speak, I heard Mrs. Henderson addressing the board about questionable parenting choices affecting student outcomes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "We have parents who don't prioritize education," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Parents who teach their children that manual labor is more important than academic achievement. These children come to school unprepared for the intellectual challenges of high school and college. They drag down the overall performance of our district." She never said my name, but everyone in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. When I was finally called to speak, my hands were shaking. I stood at that podium and tried to explain that working with your hands didn't mean you couldn't use your brain, that understanding how things worked was every bit as valuable as memorizing when they were invented. But I could see the polite smiles that said they were just waiting for me to finish so they could move on to more important matters. The industrial arts funding was cut that night, along with David's favorite class. Walking out of that building, I felt smaller than I had in years. Not because of what they'd said about me, I'd heard worse, but because of what they were doing. To my son. They were convincing him that his interests were worthless, that his way of seeing the world was wrong, that he needed to change who he was to fit their definition of success. That night, David was unusually quiet at dinner. We were eating at our small kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg that we'd fixed together with the ingenious wedge system David had designed. Finally, he looked up from his plate and said, "Dad, maybe I should try to be more like the other kids." Something broke inside me when he said that, not because I thought he was weak, but because I realized that despite all my efforts to protect him, the world was slowly grinding down his spirit. They were teaching him to be ashamed of who he was, to apologize for his gifts, to dim his light so others would feel more comfortable. I set down my fork and looked at my son. Really looked at him. At 14, he was taller than I'd been at his age, with his mother's dark eyes but my stubborn chin. His hands, already calloused from working alongside me, were gentle and precise. When he handled delicate electronics. He had fixed the neighbor's washing machine the previous week, diagnosing a problem that had stumped 3 different repair services. "David," I said, choosing my words carefully, Do you remember when Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson fell down that storm drain last year, and the fire department couldn't figure out how to get him out safely? He nodded. Yeah, you designed that pulley system to lift him out. Do you remember who helped me build it? A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. We built it together, in like 45 minutes. And do you remember what the fire chief said afterward? He said it was the most elegant solution he'd ever seen to that kind of problem. I leaned forward. Son, those people who say you're different, who say our way of doing things is wrong, they're not bad people. They're just scared of what they don't understand. But you don't have to apologize for being exactly who God made you to be. But even as I said those words, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was holding David back by teaching him to love work more than homework, to value practical skills over theoretical knowledge. Maybe he would end up limiting his options, trapped in the blue-collar world I'd tried so hard to escape from in my own youth. The doubt ate at me as David began high school. He struggled in traditional academic classes, not because he wasn't smart, but because he learned differently. His grades were mediocre, his test scores unremarkable. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Phillips, called me in for a meeting halfway through his freshman year. Mr. Martinez, she said, pulling out a thick folder. I'm concerned about David's trajectory. His grades suggest he's not college material. Have you considered vocational training? Maybe he could learn a trade? The way she said trade made it sound like a consolation prize, something for kids who couldn't hack it in the real world. I wanted to tell her that my son could take apart a computer and rebuild it blindfolded, that he'd designed a more efficient ventilation system for the school's workshop that had saved them hundreds of dollars in energy costs. But I just nodded and promised to have a talk with him. The pattern continued through sophomore and junior year. David's grades remained average, his SAT scores were below the national average, and his college prospects looked dim. The other parents had stopped making snide comments. Now they just offered sympathetic smiles, as if my son had some sort of chronic illness they were too polite to mention. It's such a shame, I overheard Mrs. Henderson say at a school fundraiser. Roberto tried so hard, but some children just aren't meant for academic success. At least David seems happy enough to follow in his father's footsteps. The implication was clear. I had ruined my son's life by teaching him to love work, by showing him that there was dignity in fixing things, in creating solutions with your hands as well as your mind. I started to believe them. As senior year approached, the pressure for college applications intensified. David's guidance counselor had essentially written him off, suggesting community college as his best option. The other parents talked about their children's acceptance letters to prestigious universities, their scholarship offers, their bright futures. I began to prepare myself for the disappointment. Maybe I had failed him. Maybe all those years of teaching him to be proud of who he was had actually been selfishness on my part, keeping him in a world that no longer valued what he had to offer. But David surprised me. Instead of seeming defeated, he became more focused, more determined. He spent long hours working on something in the garage, something he wouldn't let me see. He applied to only 3 colleges, all with strong engineering programs, despite his mediocre transcripts. Dad, he said one evening, looking up from his laptop, I want to write my own graduation speech. I know I'm not valedictorian or salutatorian, but I want to apply to be one of the student speakers. I was shocked. David had always been articulate, but he'd never been one for public speaking. Son, are you sure? There will be a lot of people there. He smiled, and for the first time in months I saw the old confidence in his eyes. I'm sure, Dad. I have something I need to say. The selection process for graduation speakers was competitive. Students had to submit their speeches in advance to a committee of teachers and administrators. I didn't read David's speech when he was writing it. He said he wanted it to be a surprise. 2 weeks later, he came home with a grin that lit up the room. "I got selected, Dad. I'm speaking at graduation." I was proud, but also nervous. I knew that many of the same people, who had spent years criticizing our choices, would be in that audience. I worried that they would find new ways to judge us, new reasons to confirm their beliefs about David's limitations. As the graduation day approached, David seemed unusually calm and confident. He spent hours practicing his speech in his room, and I could hear his voice carrying through the thin walls, though I couldn't make out the words. He had also been working late into the night on whatever project he'd been hiding in the garage. The morning of graduation, he finally showed me what he'd been working on. In the center of our garage sat a miniature model of a wind turbine, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The design was elegant and complex, with innovative features that seemed to address common problems with wind energy efficiency. "I built this for my speech," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "It's part of my presentation." I stared at the intricate machine, understanding perhaps for the first time just how much David had absorbed over the years, how all those hours of working together had culminated in something extraordinary. But I also felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. "Son," I said carefully, "you know that machine might not be what people expect from a graduation speech." He looked at me with the same expression he'd worn as a little boy when I'd taught him. His first lesson about fixing things. Patient, confident, a little amused by my worry. "Dad," he said, "remember what you always told me. Sometimes the most important job is fixing something that everyone else thinks is already broken." That weeks leading up to graduation were strange in our house. David had a new energy about him, a quiet determination that reminded me of when he was 7 and had spent 3 days trying to fix our broken radio without asking for help. He'd emerge from his room each morning looking like he'd barely slept, but his eyes were bright with purpose. I found myself watching him differently during those final weeks of high school. When he sat at our kitchen table, pencil in hand, surrounded by engineering diagrams and equations I barely recognized, I saw something I'd been too worried to notice before. This wasn't just my son who liked fixing things anymore. This was a young man who understood systems, who could see connections between ideas that others missed. One evening, I was washing dishes when I heard him on the phone with someone, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. "No, sir, I understand the theoretical framework," he was saying, "but the implementation has practical limitations that could be addressed with a modified gear ratio and repositioned bearings." I dried my hands slowly, listening. He was talking to Professor Williams at the State University's engineering department, discussing his wind turbine project. David had reached out to him without telling me, seeking expert feedback on his design. After he hung up, I asked him about the conversation. "Professor Williams wants to see the actual model," David said, unable to hide his excitement. "He said the design addresses several problems they've been working on in their renewable energy lab." I felt a complex mix of pride and regret. Pride, because my son was impressing university professors. Regret, because I realized how much I'd been limiting my own expectations of what he could achieve. The next morning, David asked me something unexpected. "Dad, would you help me practice my speech? Not the words. I've got those down. But I want to practice setting up the demonstration." We spent the next hour in the garage, with David explaining the mechanics of his wind turbine while I played, the role of confused audience member. His explanations were clear, passionate, and surprisingly sophisticated. He didn't just understand how each component worked. He understood why the traditional approaches weren't working and how his modifications addressed those shortcomings. "Where did you learn all this?" I asked, genuinely amazed. He smiled. "From you, Dad. Every time you taught me to look at why something was broken instead of just replacing it. Every time you showed me that the simplest solution is usually the best one. And from watching you never give up on fixing things that everyone else said weren't worth fixing." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took the day off work and drove to the library. I wanted to understand more about what David was working on, to educate myself about wind energy and engineering principles that I'd never formally studied. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, seemed surprised to see me. "Mr. Martinez, is everything all right?" "I'm trying to learn about renewable energy systems," I said, feeling somewhat foolish. "My son has built something, and I want to understand it better." She smiled warmly and led me to the science section. For the next 3 hours, I read about wind turbine design, energy efficiency, and the engineering principles behind renewable energy. Much of it was over my head, but I began to grasp the significance of what David had created. When I got home, I found David in the garage, making final adjustments to his model. Without saying anything, I picked up a wrench and started helping him with the fine-tuning. "Dad," he said after a while, "did you know that less than 60% of traditional wind turbines operate at optimal efficiency because of design limitations that have been accepted as standard for decades?" I shook my head. "My design changes could increase efficiency by at least 25%, maybe more. Professor Williams thinks it could revolutionize small-scale wind energy production." I set down my wrench and looked at my son. "David, why haven't you told me how significant this is?" He shrugged, suddenly looking like the uncertain teenager he still was. "Because what if it's not? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just the kid whose dad taught him to fix things, and I'm in over my head?" I understood then that David had been carrying the same doubts I had, the same fears about whether he was good enough, smart enough, worthy of the bigger dreams that seemed reserved for other people's children. "Son," I said, sitting down on a crate, "let me tell you something I should have told you years ago. When I was your age, I was the smartest kid in my class at math and science. My teachers said I should go to engineering school, but my father was a mechanic, and everyone told me I should stick to what I knew, that college wasn't for people like us." David looked surprised. I'd never told him this story. I let other people's expectations define what I thought I could become. I chose the safe path, the expected path, and I don't regret it entirely. It brought me to raising you. But I've always wondered what might have happened if I'd had the courage to ignore what other people thought was realistic for someone like me. I stood up and put my hand on his shoulder. "You're not just someone like me, David. You're someone better than me. You have opportunities I never had, not because the world has changed, but because you've had the courage to pursue what interests you despite what others think." The week of graduation, the local newspaper ran a story about the graduating seniors. David's name appeared in a small paragraph about students planning to pursue careers in technical fields. Mrs. Henderson's son, meanwhile, was featured prominently for his acceptance to an Ivy League school and his plans to major in business. I'll admit it stung. But when I showed David the article, he just laughed. "Dad, do you know what Mrs. Henderson's son has already accomplished that will benefit other people?" I shook my head. "Neither do I," David said simply. "But I know what I've built could provide clean energy to communities that can't afford large-scale wind farms." 2 days before graduation, David received a phone call that would change everything. Professor Williams had shown David's design to colleagues in the engineering department, and they wanted to offer him a full scholarship to study renewable energy engineering. Not only that, but they wanted to support his research project with lab funding and graduate student mentorship. David hung up the phone and turned to me, stunned. "Dad, they want me to come to the university. They think my project has real potential for development and patent application." I felt my knees go weak. My son, the one teachers had written off, the one guidance counselors had steered toward community college, the one Mrs. Henderson had predicted would amount to nothing, had been offered opportunities that most students could only dream of. That evening, we celebrated at our kitchen table with pizza and soda. David was quiet, processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Dad," he said finally, All those years when people said I was different, when they said you were teaching me the wrong things. Did you ever believe them? I considered lying, giving him the answer I thought he needed. But David deserved honesty. Sometimes, I admitted. Sometimes I wondered if I was limiting your future by teaching you to love work that people didn't consider intellectual enough. But I also knew that you were happy, that you were learning to solve problems, that you understood the value of perseverance and precision. I'm glad you never stopped, he said, because everything they said was wrong about us made me who I am today. The morning of graduation dawned clear and bright. David was up early, carefully loading his wind turbine model into the truck. He'd spent the previous evening polishing every component until it gleamed. As we drove to the school, I felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation that I hadn't experienced since David was born. I knew that many of the people who had criticized our choices over the years would be in that audience. Part of me wanted to protect David from their judgment one more time. You nervous? I asked. David smiled. No, Dad. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, saying what I need to say. We arrived at the school to find the parking lot already crowded. David carefully carried his model while I helped with the supporting materials he'd prepared. As we walked toward the building, I saw Mrs. Henderson near the entrance, holding a bouquet of flowers for her son. She saw us approaching, and her eyes immediately went to the wind turbine model. Her expression was one of polite confusion, as if she couldn't quite figure out why someone would bring such a thing to a graduation ceremony. Hello, Roberto, she said coolly. David, I see you're bringing props for your speech? Yes, ma'am, David replied politely. I wanted to show people something I've been working on. She smiled the kind of smile adults give to children who are about to embarrass themselves. How creative. I'm sure it will be memorable. After she walked away, David looked at me and chuckled. Dad, do you think she'd believe me if I told her 3 universities have already expressed interest in licensing my design? Let's let your speech do the talking, I said. Inside the auditorium, I found a seat in the middle section while David went to join the other graduating seniors. The room filled quickly with families, teachers, and school board members. I spotted the principal, the guidance counselors who had written David off, and many of the parents who had spent years predicting his failure. The ceremony began with the usual processions, songs, and administrative speeches. David was scheduled to speak third, after the valedictorian and salutatorian. When the first 2 speakers delivered their addresses, perfectly crafted, inspirational, and utterly forgettable, I felt my anxiety building. Then the principal approached the microphone. Our next speaker is David Martinez. David has chosen to speak about innovation and perseverance, and I understand he has prepared a demonstration to accompany his remarks. David walked to the stage, and 2 volunteers helped him set up his wind turbine model on a table next to the podium. I could see people in the audience whispering, some smiling in anticipation of what they clearly expected to be an amateur presentation. Mrs. Henderson was sitting 2 rows ahead of me. I watched her lean over to the woman next to her and whisper something that made them both chuckle softly. David adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. For a moment, he found my eyes, and I gave him an encouraging nod. Then he began to speak. 4 years ago, my father and I were fixing Mrs. Rodriguez's air conditioner on the hottest day of summer. While we worked, she told us about her electricity bill, how she couldn't afford to run the AC even though she desperately needed it. My father looked at her ancient unit and said something I'll never forget. Mrs. Rodriguez, the problem isn't just that this is broken. The problem is that it was designed to break. David's voice was clear and confident. The audience had quieted, perhaps intrigued by this unexpected opening. That day taught me that the most important innovations don't come from making new things. They come from fixing old problems that everyone has accepted as inevitable. He gestured to his wind turbine model. This is a wind turbine. but it's not like the ones you might have seen. Traditional wind turbines lose up to 40% of their potential energy due to design limitations that the industry has simply accepted. I wondered, what if we didn't accept that? What if we approached the problem differently? David activated his model. The turbine began to spin smoothly, but what caught everyone's attention was how silent it was compared to traditional designs, and how even the slightest air movement seemed to generate rotation. My design incorporates 3 key innovations, David continued, his passion evident in every word. First, magnetic levitation bearings that eliminate friction loss. Second, variable pitch blades that automatically adjust to optimize wind capture at any speed. And third, a power conversion system that maintains consistent output even when wind conditions fluctuate. I watched the faces in the audience change from polite attention to genuine interest. Several adults were leaning forward, studying the model with new respect. Last month, I was contacted by Professor Williams at State University. He's part of a team working on sustainable energy solutions for developing countries. He told me that my design could provide reliable electricity to communities that can't access traditional power grids. David paused, letting that sink in. But this isn't really a speech about wind turbines. It's about the value of thinking differently, about the importance of learning from people who see problems others ignore. He looked directly at where I was sitting. My father is a maintenance supervisor. He never went to engineering school. But he taught me that every broken thing is a puzzle waiting to be solved, that understanding why something fails is the first step to making it better. He taught me that intelligence isn't measured by test scores or college admissions. It's measured by your ability to improve the world around you. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Around me, the audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. For years, people told me I was different, that I thought wrong, that I focused on the wrong things. Teachers said I should concentrate less on how things work and more on memorizing facts for tests. Guidance counselors suggested I lower my expectations. Some of you probably thought my father was wasting my potential by teaching me to work with my hands instead of pushing me to be more academic. David's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But here's what I learned. Innovation doesn't come from following the same path everyone else takes. It comes from combining different perspectives, from understanding both theory and practice, from refusing to accept that things have to be the way they've always been. He activated a feature of his turbine that made it demonstrate different wind conditions. Next fall, I'll be starting at State University on a full academic scholarship, studying renewable energy engineering. But more importantly, the research team wants to develop my design for real-world implementation. They believe it could provide electricity to remote communities worldwide. A murmur of amazement rippled through the audience. I saw Mrs. Henderson turn in her seat, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before. My father always told me that fixing something isn't just about the thing itself. It's about making life better for the people who depend on it. He taught me that there's no shame in working hard, in getting your hands dirty, in choosing to care about problems that others overlook. David's voice softened, became more personal. To my classmates who feel like you don't fit the traditional mold of success, your different perspective isn't a limitation. It's your greatest strength. The world doesn't need more people who think the same way. It needs people who see solutions where others see permanent problems. He looked out over the audience one final time. Thank you for teaching me, through your doubts and your criticism, that the most valuable validation comes not from meeting other people's expectations, but from exceeding your own. To my father, who never stopped believing that understanding how to fix things would eventually help me build something new. This is for you. David stepped back from the podium as the audience erupted in applause. But this wasn't polite graduation applause. This was the sound of people genuinely moved, genuinely impressed, genuinely forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this quiet boy and his unconventional father. I stood up, clapping until my hands hurt, tears streaming down my face. Around me, other parents and teachers were on their feet as well. I saw David's former guidance counselor wiping her eyes. The principal was nodding with obvious admiration. And Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson was staring at David with an expression of complete shock and something that looked like respect. As David carefully packed up his wind turbine model, I realized that this wasn't just his moment of triumph. It was validation for every unconventional choice we'd made, every time we'd chosen our own path despite the pressure to conform, every moment I'd doubted myself but kept going anyway. My son hadn't just delivered a speech. He'd transformed a room full of people who thought they had him figured out. He'd proven that the very qualities they'd tried to discourage in him were exactly what made him capable of extraordinary things. And in that moment, watching my son accept congratulations from people who had once written him off, I finally understood what he'd meant when he said his speech was about fixing things that everyone else thought were already broken. Sometimes, what needs fixing isn't the machine, or the system, or the child. Sometimes what needs fixing is the way people see possibility. The auditorium was still buzzing with conversation 15 minutes after David's speech ended. I watched, in amazement as a line formed of people wanting to speak with him. Professors I didn't recognize, community members, even some of the parents who had spent years questioning our choices. Dr. Sarah Chen, the district's science coordinator, was the first to reach David. I'd met her years ago when she'd suggested David needed more structured learning environments because he kept disassembling the equipment in her classes to understand how it worked. "David," she said, her voice filled with something between admiration and embarrassment, "I owe you an apology, and I'd like to ask if you'd consider speaking to our incoming freshmen about thinking outside traditional academic frameworks." Behind her, Mr. Thompson from the school board waited patiently. The same man who had voted to cut the industrial arts program that David loved. When his turn came, he didn't waste words. "Son, the district made a mistake when we eliminated hands-on learning programs. Would you be willing to consult with us on developing new curriculum that bridges practical and theoretical education?" David handled each conversation with grace, beyond his 18 years. But I could see the irony wasn't lost on him. These were the same people who had dismissed his learning style, who had pushed him toward conformity, who had seen his differences as deficits rather than advantages. Mrs. Henderson approached me while David was surrounded by well-wishers. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. "Roberto," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with her words. "I was wrong. About David, about you, about what success looks like." She paused, looking over at my son, who was patiently explaining some technical aspect of his wind turbine to a group of fascinated graduates. "My son got into Harvard," she continued. "I've spent 4 years making sure everyone knew that, but watching David today, I realized I don't know what my son is passionate about. I don't know what problems he wants to solve or what gets him excited about learning." Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "I pushed him so hard to achieve traditional success that I forgot to ask what kind of success would make him happy." I didn't know what to say. For years, this woman had made our lives difficult with her judgment and criticism. Now she stood before me, vulnerable and reflective. "It's not too late," I said finally. "Success isn't defined by where you go to college. It's defined by who you become and how you use your gifts to help others." She nodded slowly. "Your son proved that today, and you proved that unconventional parenting might be exactly what the world needs." As the crowd began to thin, Professor Williams approached with 2 other people I didn't recognize. David was still talking animatedly with students and parents, but the professor gestured for me to join their conversation. "Mr. Martinez," Professor Williams said warmly, "I want you to meet Dr. Lisa Patel from MIT's Renewable Energy Lab and Dr. James Wright from Stanford's Design Innovation Program." Dr. Patel stepped forward with a smile. "Mr. Martinez, your son's design is remarkable, but what impressed us even more was how he presented it. The clarity with which he explained complex engineering concepts to a general audience shows real pedagogical ability." "Pedagogical ability?" I asked, not familiar with the term. "Teaching ability," Dr. Wright clarified. "We've seen brilliant engineers who can't communicate their ideas to others. David has both technical innovation and the ability to inspire others to understand and care about his work." Professor Williams nodded. "We're not just interested in David's research potential. We're considering him for our Emerging Leaders program, where exceptional students work directly with faculty on projects that address global challenges while mentoring younger students." I felt dizzy. A year ago, David's guidance counselor had been steering him toward trade school. Now, 3 of the country's top universities were discussing leadership programs and global impact. "There's something else," Dr. Patel added. "David mentioned that his approach to problem-solving came from working alongside you, learning to diagnose issues by understanding systems from the ground up. We'd like to invite you to speak to our students about practical application of theoretical concepts." "Me?" I asked, certain I'd misheard. "Speak to MIT students?" "You've taught your son to see problems differently," Dr. Wright explained. "That kind of practical wisdom is exactly what our future engineers need. Too many of them can design beautiful theoretical solutions that fail in real-world applications." After they exchanged contact information with David and me, I stood in the empty auditorium, trying to process everything that had happened. David was carefully packing his wind turbine while the maintenance crew began setting up for the evening concert. "Dad," David said, looking up from his task, "can I tell you something?" I nodded, still somewhat in shock. "When I was writing my speech, I kept thinking about all the times you could have told me to be more like other kids, to focus more on grades and less on building things. You never did. You never made me feel like I had to choose between who I was and who I needed to become." He secured the last component of his model. Today wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving we were right all along. That love isn't about forcing someone into a mold. It's about helping them discover their own shape. That evening, our phone rang constantly. First, it was Maria, David's mother, calling from Phoenix. Someone had posted video of David's speech online, and it had already gone viral on social media. "Roberto," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've made so many mistakes. David is incredible, and I know it's because of what you've taught him. I'm sorry for leaving. I'm sorry for missing this." After I hung up, David looked at me questioningly. "Your mom saw the video," I explained. "She wanted to congratulate you." David nodded thoughtfully. "Dad, I've been angry at her for a long time, but watching how you dealt with all the criticism we faced, you never once badmouthed her. You taught me that holding on to anger just weighs you down when you could be building something better." The next morning brought more surprises. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story. 3 different news stations requested interviews, but the most meaningful call came from Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor. "Roberto, mijo," she said through tears. "I watched the video of David's speech. My granddaughter in California sent it to me. That boy, he's going to change the world." She paused, then continued. "But I wanted to tell you something. Remember that day you 2 fixed my air conditioner when David was just a little boy? After you left, David came back by himself. He wanted to make sure I understood how to adjust the settings so it would run more efficiently. He was maybe 10 years old, and he was already thinking about how to help people." Over the following weeks, David's story continued to spread. The video of his speech was shared millions of times, with comments from around the world. Young people wrote about feeling inspired to pursue their unconventional interests. Parents shared stories about supporting children who didn't fit traditional academic molds, but perhaps the most impactful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after graduation, we received a letter from a school in rural Guatemala. The principal had seen David's speech online and reached out through a missionary organization. "Our village has limited electricity," the letter read in carefully translated English. "Your son's wind turbine design could bring power to our school and clinic. Would he consider working with us to build and install such a system?" David read the letter 3 times, then looked at me with the same expression he'd worn as a child, when I'd first shown him how to fix something broken. "Dad, what if we went? What if we actually helped them build it?" And so began a new chapter. David deferred his university enrollment for 1 year to work on what became known as the Guatemala Project. Together with a team of engineering students and volunteer organization, David spent 6 months developing a scaled version of his wind turbine design suitable for rural installation. I took a leave of absence from my job to accompany him. First I worried I'd be in the way, just an American maintenance worker in a place full of engineers and academics. But I discovered that my years of experience with practical problem-solving were invaluable when the sophisticated designs met real-world challenges. The village of San Miguel Alto sat at 8,000 feet elevation, where strong winds made traditional turbines inefficient or dangerous. David's design, with its self-adjusting blade system and magnetic bearings, proved perfect for the conditions. But the project became about more than just electricity. Working alongside villagers, David learned that true innovation requires understanding, not just the technical problem, but the people who need the solution. "Dad," he said one evening as we sat outside our simple lodging, watching his turbines generate power for the village clinic, "I used to think engineering was about making things work. Now I think it's about making life work better for people." The project's success attracted international attention. When we returned to Ohio, David found that his university experience would be unlike anything we'd imagined. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a recognized innovator with real-world impact. His freshman year was a whirlwind of classes, research opportunities, and speaking engagements. David spoke at conferences about sustainable development, was featured in engineering magazines, and consulted with organizations implementing renewable energy in developing countries. But what I was most proud of was how he remained unchanged by the attention. He still called me every Sunday, still helped rebuild our truck's transmission during Christmas break, still treated every problem as a puzzle worth solving rather than an obstacle to avoid. One Sunday afternoon, about 8 months after graduation, David showed up at the house unexpectedly. He'd driven down from the university with something he wanted to show me. "Dad, I've been working on something new," he said, leading me to the garage. "Remember how Mrs. Chen asked me to speak to freshmen about thinking differently? I realized that most engineering students never get hands-on experience until their junior year. They spend 2 years learning theory without understanding how it applies to real problems." He unveiled his latest project, a teaching kit that combined traditional engineering concepts with practical building exercises. Students could learn physics by working with actual machines, understand materials, science by handling different components, grasp systems thinking by assembling functional devices. "The university wants to pilot this in 5 engineering programs," David said. "But Dad, I want you to help develop the curriculum. You know better than anyone how to teach someone to understand why things break and how to fix them." That fall, I found myself walking into MIT as an educational consultant. Me, Roberto Martinez, a maintenance supervisor from Ohio, working with some of the brightest minds in engineering education to develop curriculum that bridged theory and practice. The experience was intimidating at first. I sat in rooms with PhDs and department heads, feeling certain they'd realize I didn't belong. But David had been right. My decades of experience fixing complex systems, of diagnosing problems through investigation rather than assumption, of teaching through demonstration rather than lecture, proved exactly what these programs needed. The pilot program exceeded all expectations. Students who learned through David's hands-on approach showed better retention, stronger problem-solving skills, and more creative thinking than those in traditional courses. More importantly, they developed an intuition for how engineering solutions would perform in the real world. 2 years later, I stood in a very different auditorium, watching David deliver the keynote address at the National Engineering Education Conference. He was 20 years old, and already his approaches to combining practical and theoretical learning were being adopted by universities across the country. But this time, I wasn't surprised by his success. I'd learned to expect remarkable things from my son, not because he was perfect, but because he'd been taught to see opportunity where others saw limitations. "My father is in the audience tonight," David said during his speech, finding me in the crowd with that same smile he'd worn at his high school graduation. "He's the maintenance supervisor who became an educational consultant, the man who taught me that the most profound learning happens when you understand not just what something does, but why it matters." After the conference, we drove back to Ohio together. David would be starting his graduate work in the fall, focused on sustainable technology implementation in underserved communities. He'd been accepted to MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, but had chosen to stay at State University to continue working with Professor Williams on community-based engineering solutions. "Dad," he said as we pulled into our driveway, "do you ever regret the way we did things? All those years when people said we were wrong?" I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who now directed a program encouraging non-traditional approaches to education. About David's former guidance counselor, who had written a letter of apology that we still kept on our refrigerator. About all the parents who'd once pitied my choices and now asked for advice on how to support their children's unconventional interests. "Son," I said, "the only thing I regret is ever doubting that loving someone enough to let them be themselves is always the right choice." That night, I sat in our kitchen, listening to David move around in his old room, packing for his return to university. The house felt different now, not empty, but full of potential. David's wind turbine model sat on our mantel next to photos from Guatemala, certificates from universities, and letters from communities around the world where his innovations had brought light to darkness. But most precious of all was a framed copy of his high school graduation speech, with a handwritten note at the bottom. "Dad, thank you for teaching me that the most important thing about fixing something isn't knowing how to take it apart. It's understanding what it's supposed to do when it works." I thought about all the people who had laughed at our choices, who had predicted failure for a boy who didn't fit their definition of academic success. They weren't wrong to want children to succeed, but they hadn't understood that success has many forms, and the most meaningful ones often come from embracing what makes someone different rather than trying to make them the same. David hadn't just proven them wrong. He'd proven that there are many paths to extraordinary, and sometimes the most unconventional path leads to the most remarkable destination. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I smiled thinking about tomorrow. David would return to university, where he'd continue developing solutions to problems others hadn't even noticed. I'd go back to my job, but also continue work on educational programs that helped other children learn the value of understanding how things work. And somewhere out there, in villages and communities around the world, wind turbines designed by my son would turn in the breeze, generating not just electricity, but hope that problems once thought unsolvable could be fixed by someone who learned to see them differently. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't protection from the world's criticism. Sometimes it's the confidence to prove the critics wrong. But most often, it's simply the unwavering belief that who they are is exactly who they're meant to be. 5 years had passed since David's graduation speech, and life had a way of surprising us both in ways we never could have imagined. I was sitting in my office at MIT. Yes, MIT actually gave me an office, reviewing curriculum materials, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from our old neighborhood in Ohio. "Mr. Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh. I'm the principal at Lincoln Middle School now. I hope you remember me. I used to teach 8th grade science when David was a student. I remembered her well. She'd been one of the few teachers who had encouraged David's unconventional approach to learning, even when it meant he turned, in projects that didn't quite fit the assignment parameters. Of course, Mrs. Walsh. Congratulations on your promotion. Thank you. I'm calling because we're implementing a new program here, and I wondered if you and David might be interested in helping us launch it. We're calling it the Innovation Workshop, a space where students can work on real-world problems using both hands-on and theoretical approaches. She paused, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. The school board finally realized what you tried to tell them years ago. We were failing students like David by forcing them into rigid academic boxes. This program is designed to nurture different kinds of intelligence and show students that there are many paths to success. A week later, David and I drove back to Ohio together. He was now in his 3rd year of graduate school, but had taken a semester off to launch a social enterprise focused on bringing sustainable technology to underserved communities. His work had caught the attention of the United Nations, and he'd been invited to speak at their upcoming Climate Solutions Summit. But none of that seemed to matter as much to him as this return to our old school. "Dad," he said as we pulled into the parking lot, "do you realize this is where it all started? That 8th grade science fair where I built the solar water heater? That didn't work properly?" I smiled, remembering how disappointed he'd been when his project failed to heat water to the temperature he'd calculated. Mrs. Walsh had helped him understand that failure was just another form of data, and that understanding why something didn't work was often more valuable than having it work perfectly the first time. The school looked different, not just because it had been renovated, but because there was an energy about it that hadn't been there before. Students were carrying projects through the hallways, engaged in animated discussions about problem-solving strategies. Mrs. Walsh met us at the entrance, beaming with pride. "Roberto, David, welcome back. I can't wait to show you what we've built." She led us through hallways lined with photos of students working on various projects, not just academic achievements, but real-world applications. I saw a picture of a group of 7th graders who had designed a water filtration system for a local park. Another showed 8th graders working with senior citizens to create assistive devices for daily living. "The transformation has been incredible," Mrs. Walsh explained as we walked. "We've had to rethink everything about how we measure success. Test scores are still important, but we also measure innovation, collaboration, persistence, and real-world impact." She stopped in front of a wall display titled Non-Traditional Paths to Success and pointed to a large photo in the center. It was David's graduation picture with a quote beneath it. "Innovation comes from thinking differently, not thinking better." "David's story has become legendary here," she said, "but what's even more wonderful is that it's no longer exceptional. We have dozens of students now who are finding their own unique ways to excel." The Innovation Workshop was everything Mrs. Walsh had promised and more. The space buzzed with activity, students working with 3D printers, others testing electrical circuits, a group collaborating on what looked like architectural models. But what struck me most was the atmosphere. There was joy here. Students weren't just completing assignments. They were exploring, experimenting, failing, and trying again with enthusiasm. "Mr. Martinez!" I turned to see a young girl, maybe 13, running toward us with a notebook clutched to her chest. "You're David's dad, right? I'm Sarah Chen, Dr. Chen's daughter. My mom told me you taught David everything about fixing things and thinking creatively." I looked at David, who was grinning widely. Dr. Chen had been one of his harshest critics in elementary school. "Sarah here is working on something pretty amazing," David said. "Want to show my dad what you're building?" Sarah's face lit up as she led us to her workstation. Spread across the table were components of what appeared to be a prosthetic hand, but unlike any I'd ever seen. My little brother was born without his left hand, Sarah explained, her voice filled with passion. The prosthetics available are either really expensive or really basic, so I'm designing one that uses smartphone technology to control gesture recognition. She demonstrated how the prototype recognized subtle muscle movements in the forearm and translated them into precise finger movements. The really cool part, she continued, is that it's designed to be manufactured with mostly off-the-shelf components and 3D printing, so it can be produced for a fraction of the cost of traditional prosthetics. I was speechless. This 13-year-old was solving problems that had challenged engineers for decades. Sarah, David said quietly, how long have you been working on this? 2 years. My mom wanted me to focus more on traditional academics, but Mrs. Walsh created this independent study program where I could work on it during school hours if I maintained my grades in other subjects. After Sarah returned to her work, David and I stood in silence for a moment. Dad, he said finally, this is what it could have been like for me if this program had existed then. Mrs. Walsh rejoined us, followed by a man I didn't immediately recognize. Roberto, I'd like you to meet Tom Henderson, our new Director of Innovation Education. My eyes widened. Tom Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's son, the one who had gone to Harvard, the one she had held up as the model of traditional success. Tom extended his hand with a warm smile. Mr. Martinez, it's an honor to meet you. My mother has told me so much about you and David. Tom graduated from Harvard with a degree in business, Mrs. Walsh explained. But he came back here specifically to help us develop this program. He wanted to create something he felt he missed in his own education. Tom nodded. I spent 4 years at Harvard learning to think inside very prestigious boxes. It wasn't until I saw David's graduation speech that I realized I'd never been encouraged to question the boxes themselves. He gestured around the workshop. This program isn't just about letting kids build things. It's about teaching them that there are multiple forms of intelligence, multiple definitions of success, and that the most valuable innovations often come from people who see problems differently. My mother was wrong about a lot of things. Tom continued, his voice thoughtful. She measured success by external validation rather than internal purpose. Watching David's journey made her realize that she'd pushed me toward achievements that looked impressive, but didn't actually fulfill me. He paused, looking around at the busy students. I left my consulting job in Boston to come back here because I wanted to help create the kind of educational environment that nurtures innovators like David, like Sarah, like all these kids who think differently. Over the next several hours, David and I met student after student whose stories resonated with themes we knew well. There was Marcus, a young man with ADHD who couldn't sit still in traditional classes, but had designed a kinetic energy harvesting system for the school playground. Maria, a quiet girl whose social anxiety made class participation difficult, had created a communication app that helped nonverbal students express themselves. The most beautiful part, Mrs. Walsh told us as we prepared to leave, is watching how these students support each other. They understand that being different isn't a limitation. It's a superpower waiting to be discovered. As we drove home that evening, David was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "I was just wondering," he said slowly. "What would have happened if I'd had this kind of environment all along? Not because I think I missed out, but because it makes me realize how many other kids like me never got the chance to prove what they could do." The following months brought unexpected opportunities to expand our impact. David's Guatemala project had evolved into a nonprofit organization that now operated in 12 countries. The educational curriculum we'd developed at MIT was being adopted by engineering schools worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful development was when Tom Henderson reached out with an ambitious proposal. "David, Roberto," he said during a video call, "what if we could scale the innovation workshop model What if instead of just transforming one school, we could transform how society thinks about education and success? Tom had been working with a group of educators, entrepreneurs, and policymakers to develop a nationwide network of innovation centers. The goal was to provide every community with a space where non-traditional learning could flourish. We need advocates, Tom continued. People who understand what it's like to be dismissed by conventional systems, but who proved those systems wrong. Would you consider joining our board? David looked at me through the screen. Dad, what do you think? Before I could answer, Tom added, Roberto, we specifically want you involved. Your perspective on practical education and your journey from maintenance worker to MIT consultant represents exactly the kind of non-traditional path we want to normalize. 6 months later, I found myself standing on a stage in Washington, D.C., addressing a conference of education policymakers. The title of my talk was Fixing Education by Understanding What's Not Broken. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at an audience of superintendents, principals, and government officials. 20 years ago, I was a single father working in maintenance, trying to raise a son who didn't fit the mold of academic success. Every expert told me I was doing it wrong. I clicked to the first slide. A photo of David at age 8, covered in engine grease, smiling proudly next to our partially disassembled truck. They said teaching him to work with his hands would limit his intellectual development. They said he needed to focus on traditional academics instead of practical problem solving. They said his differentness was a disability to be corrected, not a strength to be nurtured. The next slide showed David receiving his engineering PhD, followed by photos from his work around the world. My son didn't succeed despite being different. He succeeded because he was different, because we honored his way of learning instead of trying to force him into someone else's definition of education. I spent the next 30 minutes sharing not just David's story, but the stories of students like Sarah, Marcus, and Maria. Students who were now thriving in environments that recognized multiple forms of intelligence. The problem with our education system, I concluded, isn't that it's broken beyond repair. The problem is that we keep trying to fix the students instead of fixing our understanding of what education can be. After the presentation, a woman approached me, Dr. Patricia Martinez, no relation, the Secretary of Education. Mr. Martinez, she said, your presentation has given me a lot to think about. Would you be willing to serve on a federal advisory committee for educational innovation? We're looking for voices that represent non-traditional perspectives. I thought about how far David and I had come from those days when school officials questioned our choices. Dr. Martinez, I said, I'd be honored. But I want to make sure you understand. I never finished college. I'm just a maintenance worker who believed in his son. She smiled. That's exactly why we need you. Sometimes the most important insights come from people who've never been taught what's supposedly impossible. 2 years later, the innovation workshop model had been implemented in over 200 schools across the country. David had completed his PhD and was now running a research institute focused on community-centered engineering solutions. The prosthetic hand Sarah Chen had designed was being produced commercially, providing affordable options for children worldwide. But the transformation that meant the most to me was personal. I received a letter from my old supervisor at the community college where I'd worked for 20 years. Roberto, he wrote, I wanted you to know that we've implemented some of the teaching methods you developed at MIT here in our technical programs. Student engagement has increased by 40%, and our graduates are finding jobs faster than ever before. You always taught us that fixing things wasn't just about the technical solution, it was about understanding the human need behind the problem. He continued, I also wanted to apologize. There were times over the years when I didn't support your approach to David's education. I thought you were being impractical, maybe even irresponsible. I was wrong. Thank you for showing all of us That being a good parent isn't about following the rules. It's about understanding your child well enough to know when the rules need to be rewritten. That evening, I called David to share the letter. "Dad," he said after I finished reading, "Do you remember what you told me the day I was selected to speak at graduation?" "Which part?" "You said that sometimes the most important job is fixing something that everyone else thinks is already broken." I smiled, remembering. "I think we both learned that lesson," he continued. "You fixed the way people think about education by showing them a different way of learning. I fixed their assumptions about what success looks like by defining it for myself." "But Dad," he added, his voice soft, "the most important thing you fixed was me. Not because I was broken, but because you understood what I needed to become. Whole." As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's graduation speech hadn't just been about wind turbines or engineering innovation. It had been about something much more fundamental: the courage to be authentically yourself in a world that profits from conformity. Mrs. Henderson had been right about one thing all those years ago. Some people aren't cut out for traditional parenting. But what she hadn't understood was that sometimes traditional parenting isn't cut out for exceptional children. David hadn't succeeded, despite our unconventional approach. He had succeeded because of it. Because we had chosen to nurture his gifts rather than normalize his differences. Because we had valued innovation over imitation, creativity over conformity, purpose over prestige. The critics had laughed at my parenting skills, suggesting that I was setting my son up for failure by encouraging his non-traditional interests and learning style. They had predicted that he would end up limited, trapped in blue-collar work, lacking the skills needed for academic or professional success. They had been wrong about everything. But they hadn't just been wrong about David. They had been wrong about the very nature of success, intelligence, and human potential. They had failed to understand that the most profound innovations often come from those who think differently, who question assumptions, who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable simply because conventional solutions have failed. Today, David's graduation speech isn't just remembered for silencing his critics. It's studied in education programs as an example of how authentic self-expression can challenge systemic biases and inspire paradigm shifts. The video has been viewed over 10 million times, not just because it's a feel-good story, but because it represents something deeper: the possibility that every child has unique gifts waiting to be discovered and nurtured. Every parent who has ever felt criticized for supporting their child's unconventional interests, every teacher who has ever fought to implement non-traditional teaching methods, every student who has ever felt that they don't fit the mold of traditional success, they find hope in David's story. But mostly, they find validation in the truth David spoke that day: that the world doesn't need more people who think the same way. It needs people who dare to think differently, who see solutions where others see impossibilities, who understand that the most valuable innovations often come from the most unexpected places. As I finish writing this story, David is preparing for his next adventure, leading a team of young innovators to implement sustainable energy solutions in remote communities across Africa. The little boy who once took apart radios just to understand how they worked is now taking apart energy poverty, one community at a time. And me? I'm still fixing things. But now I understand that the most important thing I ever fixed wasn't a machine or a system. It was the belief that different always means deficient. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child isn't the answer to every question. Sometimes it's the confidence to question every answer. But always, it's the unwavering faith that who they are today is the foundation for who they'll become tomorrow, and that foundation is stronger when built on authenticity rather than conformity. The critics stopped laughing long ago, but their silence speaks louder than their criticism ever did. It says that maybe, just maybe, the best way to prepare a child for an unpredictable future isn't to make them fit into existing molds, but to help them create entirely new shapes. David's graduation speech didn't just silence his critics. It amplified a truth the world needed to hear. That extraordinary often begins with being willing to be different, and the most powerful validation comes not from proving others right, but from proving yourself true. 10 years had passed since David's graduation speech, and the world looked different for both of us in ways I could never have imagined. I was sitting in the United Nations building in New York, preparing to deliver a keynote address about education reform, when my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, turn on the news. The Guatemala village just got connected to the national power grid using a scaled version of my original design." My throat tightened with emotion. The little boy who used to disassemble our radio had just helped light up an entire region of Guatemala with clean, sustainable energy. But that wasn't what made this moment special. What made it special was that he'd done it while mentoring a new generation of engineers who were already thinking beyond what David had accomplished. As I stood at the podium later that day, looking out at representatives from 193 countries, I thought about how far we'd all come. The title of my address was "From Maintenance to Mentorship: How Non-Traditional Paths Create Global Solutions." "Distinguished delegates," I began. "My name is Roberto Martinez. 20 years ago, I was a maintenance supervisor in Ohio, whose unconventional approach to raising my son was criticized by educators, administrators, and other parents who believed I was limiting his potential by teaching him to work with his hands." I clicked to my first slide, a photo of David at age 6, helping me repair a neighbor's broken lawnmower. Today, that son has established sustainable energy systems in 37 countries, holds 12 patents for renewable energy innovations, and most importantly, has trained over 3,000 young engineers from underserved communities to become innovation leaders in their own countries. The next slide showed a map of the world, with pins marking every location where David's designs or teaching methods had been implemented. But this isn't really a story about my son's success. It's a story about what happens when we stop trying to fit every child into the same educational mold and start asking, what if their differences are exactly what the world needs? After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Amara Okafor, UNESCO's Director of Education Innovation. She was an elegant woman from Nigeria whose own journey from rural teacher to international education leader had inspired millions. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "your family's story has been part of our research for years. We're launching something called the Global Innovation Academy, and we want you and David to be founding board members." The Global Innovation Academy, she explained, would be a network of institutions worldwide that identified and nurtured non-traditional learners, children who, like David, thought differently but were often overlooked by conventional education systems. "We're not talking about elite schools for the privileged," Dr. Okafor clarified. "We're talking about community-based programs that find potential in unexpected places and provide pathways for innovation that don't depend on traditional academic credentials." 3 months later, I found myself in São Paulo, Brazil, visiting the first Global Innovation Academy site. David was already there, working with local engineers and students on water purification systems for favelas, the city's sprawling urban slums. What I saw there took my breath away. Children who had never set foot in a formal classroom were designing solar-powered water filters, creating hydroponic gardens from recycled materials, and developing communication systems for their communities. "Papai Roberto," called out a voice in Portuguese-accented English. It was Isabella, a 14-year-old who had caught David's attention with her mathematical approach to community resource allocation. Isabella here solved a distribution problem that has stumped urban planners for decades, David explained as we watched her demonstrate her system. She figured out how to optimize food distribution in the favela using algorithms she developed herself, without any formal training in mathematics or computer science. Isabella beamed with pride, but what struck me most was how similar her story was to David's. Dismissed by traditional educational systems, she had found ways to learn and innovate outside conventional structures. "Mr. Roberto," she said in careful English. David tells me you taught him that fixing things isn't just about replacing parts. You taught him to understand why things break. That's what I try to do with community problems. That evening, David and I sat on the roof of our modest hotel, looking out over the sprawling city lights. Dad, he said, do you see how this is happening everywhere? Kids like Isabella, like Sarah Chen back home, like hundreds of others we're working with around the world. They're proving that innovation doesn't require traditional credentials. It requires curiosity, persistence, and someone who believes in their potential. He paused, watching a plane pass overhead. But I've been thinking about something. All these young innovators we're mentoring, they're changing their communities, solving real problems. But there's still this gap between what they're accomplishing and how society measures their success. I knew what he meant. Despite all the progress, despite the Global Innovation Academy and programs like it, there was still a bias toward traditional educational achievements. Parents still worried if their children didn't follow conventional academic paths. David, I said, what if we could do something bigger? What if we could change how society defines success itself? That conversation led to what became known as the Alternative Success Initiative, working with Dr. Okafor, Tom Henderson, and a growing network of educators and policymakers from around the world. We began developing new frameworks for measuring human potential and achievement. Instead of focusing solely on test scores, college admissions, and traditional career paths, the initiative created recognition systems for community impact innovation, recognizing young people who solved real problems in their communities, collaborative leadership, acknowledging those who brought diverse groups together to tackle challenges, adaptive problem solving, celebrating people who found unconventional solutions to complex issues, mentorship multiplication, honoring those who not only achieved success but actively lifted others up. The initiative launched with a global summit in Geneva, where David was invited to deliver the opening address. I watched from the audience as my son, now 30 years old, addressed leaders from governments, corporations, and NGOs around the world. 20 years ago, David began, my father took a risk. He chose to support his son's unconventional interests, instead of forcing him to conform to traditional expectations of academic success. That choice changed both our lives. He clicked to a slide showing the network of young innovators the Global Innovation Academy had identified and supported. Today, we're asking the world to take a similar risk, to expand our definition of success beyond traditional metrics, to create space for different kinds of intelligence, different approaches to problem solving, different paths to contribution. The response was overwhelming. Within months, corporations began partnering with the initiative to identify and hire non-traditional talent. Universities developed new admission criteria that valued innovation and community impact alongside academic achievement. Governments started funding alternative education programs that focused on real-world problem-solving. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. I received a handwritten letter from Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s. Roberto, she wrote in shaky handwriting, I've spent the last 10 years watching what you and David have built, and I realize I owe you more than an apology. I owe you gratitude. Your refusal to conform to my narrow definition of good parenting didn't just save David's potential. It opened my eyes to how many children I had failed to see and support over my years in education. She continued, my son Tom tells me that every successful program he now implements begins with a simple question. What would Roberto Martinez do? That question has become our North Star for recognizing and nurturing potential in all its forms. The letter concluded, Thank you for teaching us that sometimes the most important gift you can give a child is the permission to be different. The world is better because you refuse to make David fit into everyone else's box. I shared the letter with David during one of our weekly video calls. He was now based in Kenya, where he was establishing the African Center for Sustainable Innovation, training young engineers from across the continent. Dad, he said after I finished reading, that letter represents something bigger than just Mrs. Henderson changing her mind. It represents a paradigm shift that's happening everywhere. He was right. Stories were emerging from around the world of young people whose non-traditional paths were leading to extraordinary achievements. In Mumbai, Raj Patel, a street vendor's son who had learned electronics by repairing old phones, had developed a low-cost diagnostic device that was saving lives in rural clinics across India. In Stockholm, Maya Anderson, a teenage girl with autism whose obsessive attention to detail had made her a social outcast, had designed waste management systems that were now being implemented across Scandinavia. In Lagos, Adaora Okeke, who had dropped out of university to help support her family, had created a microfinancing platform that was empowering women entrepreneurs across West Africa. Each of these young people had been overlooked or discouraged by traditional systems, but had found ways to channel their unique perspectives into world-changing innovations. 3 years later, I was invited to speak at Harvard Business School, the same institution that had once represented everything Mrs. Henderson valued about traditional success. My lecture was titled, "The Innovation Imperative: Why Business Needs Non-Traditional Thinkers." In 1997, I told the auditorium full of MBA students and faculty, if you had told me that a maintenance worker from Ohio would one day speak at Harvard, I would have asked what you were drinking. But here's what I've learned. Innovation doesn't care about your credentials. It cares about your ability to see problems differently and your persistence in solving them. I shared case studies of companies that had transformed by embracing non-traditional talent. Tech giants that found their most innovative solutions came from employees who had unconventional educational backgrounds. Manufacturing companies that solved decades-old efficiency problems by listening to floor workers rather than consultants. The question isn't whether non-traditional thinkers can contribute to business success, I concluded. The question is whether businesses can afford to keep overlooking them. After my lecture, I was approached by Sarah Patterson, a Harvard professor who had been studying alternative education models. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "your son's story has been case study material in our leadership courses for years. But I'm curious about something else. How do you handle the pressure of being seen as the father who got it right? Doesn't that create expectations for other parents that might be just as limiting as the traditional expectations you fought against?" It was a thoughtful question that went to the heart of something I'd been struggling with. As David's story became more widely known, I'd met parents who felt pressured to recreate our exact approach with their children. "That's exactly the wrong lesson to take from our story," I told her. "I didn't succeed because I found the one right way to parent. I succeeded because I paid attention to who my specific child was and what he needed. Every child is different. Every family situation is unique. I thought about all the parents I'd met who were trying to turn their children into the next David Martinez, instead of helping them become the first version of themselves. The lesson isn't to do what I did," I continued. "The lesson is to do what your child needs, even when it goes against conventional wisdom. Sometimes that means encouraging unconventional interests. Sometimes it means supporting traditional academic paths. The key is listening to who your child actually is, not who you think they should be." That conversation led to the development of the Authentic Parenting Network, a global community of parents committed to supporting their children's individual paths to success. The network wasn't about rejecting traditional education or pushing all children toward STEM fields. It was about recognizing that there are as many paths to fulfillment as there are children in the world. By this time, David had returned to the United States to establish the Institute for Community-Centered Innovation at MIT. But his approach to leadership was different from anything I'd seen in academic institutions. "Dad," he explained during one of my visits, "traditional research institutions focus on discovering new knowledge. We focus on discovering new applications for knowledge that already exists. We ask, how can we take what we know and use it to solve problems for people who need it most?" The institute was less like a traditional lab and more like a bustling community center. Graduate students worked alongside community members. Children attended summer programs where they tackled real-world challenges, and local inventors collaborated with PhD researchers on projects that directly benefited their neighborhoods. "Look at this," David said, leading me to a corner where a group of middle school students was working with engineering graduate students. "These kids are designing playground equipment that generates electricity when children play on it." It started as a simple question from one of the students. "Why can't playing help power our school?" The project was now being tested in low-income schools across the country, providing both physical activity and sustainable energy generation. I watched these young students, so confident in their ability to solve problems, so unafraid of thinking big, and I realized that David had done more than just prove conventional wisdom wrong. He had created an entirely new model for what education and innovation could look like. That evening, we had dinner with Sarah Chen, the same Sarah who had designed prosthetic hands in middle school. She was now finishing her medical residency and preparing to launch a nonprofit focused on accessible medical technology. "Dr. Martinez," she said to David, using his formal title with a grin, "I wanted to thank you for something. When I was 13 and everyone thought my prosthetic project was just a phase, you took me seriously. You treated my ideas like they mattered." She paused, becoming more serious. "But what I didn't understand then was that you weren't just encouraging me to build things. You were teaching me to believe that my way of seeing problems was valuable. That lesson has shaped everything I've done since." As I listened to their conversation, I realized that David's influence had rippled far beyond his immediate innovations. He had become a catalyst for others to pursue their own unconventional paths, to trust their unique perspectives, to believe that their ideas mattered. Later that night, as David and I walked through campus, he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Dad, do you know what the most important thing you taught me was?" I shook my head, curious. "You taught me that love isn't about controlling someone's choices or protecting them from failure. It's about giving them the tools and confidence to make their own choices and learn from their own experiences." He looked up at the illuminated dome of MIT's main building. "Every young person I mentor, every student I teach, every community I work with, I try to give them what you gave me. Not answers, but the belief that they have the capacity to find their own answers. Not a predetermined path, but the confidence to create their own path." As we reached the car, David turned to me with a smile. "You know, Dad, they still show that video of my graduation speech to incoming students here. But what they don't always understand is that the speech wasn't really about wind turbines or engineering. It was about something much simpler." "What's that?" "It was about what happens when someone believes in you enough to let you be yourself. Everything else, the innovations, the recognition, the impact, that all came from having that foundation of unconditional support for who I was, not who I was supposed to become." As I drove back to my hotel that night, I reflected on the journey from that morning when 7-year-old David had shown me his homemade birthday card to this evening discussing the global impact of community-centered innovation. The critics who had laughed at my parenting skills had fallen silent long ago, but their silence had been replaced by something more meaningful. Recognition from around the world that supporting a child's authentic development, even when it looks unconventional, can create ripple effects that extend far beyond one family's story. Tomorrow, I would fly to Singapore to speak at the World Education Forum about the importance of recognizing different forms of intelligence. Next month, I would visit the first Global Innovation Academy site in rural Tanzania, where young people were solving water scarcity issues using traditional knowledge combined with modern technology. But tonight, I was simply Roberto Martinez, a father who had believed in his son's potential when others hadn't, and who had discovered that sometimes The best way to change the world is to trust that your child already has what it takes to make their own mark on it. The boy who had been criticized for spelling his aunt's name wrong because he thought in systems rather than rules had grown up to redesign systems around the world. The father who had been laughed at for teaching his son to fix things had learned that sometimes the most important thing to fix is our own narrow definition of what success looks like. David's graduation speech hadn't just silenced his critics. It had started a global conversation about potential, purpose, and the power of thinking differently. And in the end, that conversation proved that the most revolutionary thing you can do as a parent isn't to raise a child who fits perfectly into society. It's to raise a child who has the courage and capability to reshape society to be more accepting of all the different ways humans can contribute to the world. The speech that was supposed to be about wind turbines became about something much more fundamental: the renewable energy of human potential when it's nurtured rather than standardized. And that energy, once unleashed, becomes the force that powers progress for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.